Thank you for downloading from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Support for this podcast comes from your generous gifts and donations. You can find out more about Ravi Zacharias and the team at www.rzim.org.
So he looks at Jesus, and I have a feeling, with my pragmatic bent, I would have said the same thing without meaning to be offensive. Jesus, if you are really who you claim to be, why don't you save yourself and us? Nothing outlandish about that demand, is there?
Welcome to a new week here on Just Thinking. Every day we're confronted with headlines of heartache and tragedy. We've heard of the poem Paradise Lost. Well, that title seems to be more appropriate each day. But did you know there's another side to the story? This week, we've got a powerful message from Ravi Zacharias that addresses this very issue. It's entitled Paradise Regained. Why this title? It comes from a realization made by the thief who was crucified next to Christ. Let's listen in as Ravi unfolds the rich truth of the story.
When you look at the entire narrative of Jesus Christ, he very steadily began to divulge truth to his disciples. And there are many times where he is completely frustrated with them. And before you and I become too hard on them, bear in mind what I said to you in the first service of this week, that many of our perceptions are distorted by our prejudices. Many of our perceptions are distorted by our prejudices, particularly if we perceive those prejudices to be convictions. If I, for example, have a deep-seated conviction in my heart that such and such a thing is what the Word of God says, you could try and debate me out of it in many different approaches. Chances are I will stand firm because it is something that I firmly believe. And these disciples were honest men. They were faithful men. They gave up many of their holdings and their professions, and they left their nets and their homes. Now, all of a sudden, they are being given a teaching that is quite foreign to their ears, and they don't understand why the Son of God has to die such an ignominious death. After all, if he is the Christ, if he is the Messiah, why can't he, in a radical transformation, dominate that city and rule once and for all? Why does he have to go through this ludicrous vulnerability where he is embarrassed by a handful of people who are really making a fool out of him, and he stands there helplessly? Even Pilate looks at him, and says, are you a king? And Jesus looks at Pilate and says, my kingdom is not of this world, else would my servants fight. And he says, I tell you the truth, Pilate, that they that are of the truth are going to understand me. And Pilate says, what is truth? And walks away. So here is Jesus in one of his most weak moments. He has been trying to alert the disciples to what is going to happen. They don't understand it. And so when finally he is taken up to this hill called Golgotha and he's going to be put on two pieces of timber, they're all standing in the distance because they have a complete sense of embarrassment and failure. We thought he would deliver Israel at this time, says one of the people who tried to follow him. We thought, but we were disappointed. But while he is hanging on that cross, there are two criminals hanging on either side of him. And please listen to me carefully. If I understand the Gospel of Mark, I believe it is, where we are told that in the early part of Jesus' punishment, the criminals were making fun of him also. But something has happened in the heart of one of those criminals from the first moment where the punishment began to this moment where he's hanging on the cross. And let me narrate for you the dialogue that is going on. And Jesus just comes into this dialogue at the last moment. Thief number one looks at Jesus, and he's a pragmatist. I don't know if you know what pragmatism is. Pragmatism is the philosophy that says do whatever works. That's what pragmatism is. Do whatever works. The problem with pragmatism is it doesn't work. When you only take a short-range view of things and do not take the tomorrow into consideration, pragmatism can be a costly mistake. So he looks at Jesus, and I have a feeling, with my pragmatic bent, I would have said the same thing without meaning to be offensive. Jesus, if you are really who you claim to be, why don't you save yourself and us? Nothing outlandish about that demand, is there? Thief number 2 is completely unpredictable and utterly magnificent. As he rebukes thief number 1, Jesus doesn't even respond to him, so conspicuous by his silence. The second thief looks at thief number 1 and says, "Don't you fear God?" Now, who brought God into this? How did theology enter into this whole thing? You know, thief number 1 probably wanted to say, wait a minute, buddy. The reason you and I are here is because we don't fear God. Now, all of a sudden, what's this deathbed conversion of yours? Thief number 2 says, "Don't you fear God? This man has done nothing amiss, but you and I receive the due reward of our deeds." And then he looks at Jesus and says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus looks at him and says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." There are 3 simple recognitions that this thief makes, and there are 3 simple responses in Jesus' one statement to him. Let me capture them for you. The first is what I call the marvelous ability to diagnose the problem. Unless a medical man can diagnose what is wrong with you, he will not be able to treat that predicament. And part of the challenge of problems is to be able to come up with the right diagnoses. And he looks at himself and he recognizes that the problem in that situation is himself. The problem in that situation is himself. Time magazine ran a series of articles entitled "What's Wrong with the World?" and G.K. Chesterton sent back the shortest letter to the editor. He said, "Dear sir, regarding your article, What's Wrong with the World? I am yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." And I'm sure the editor must have read it 3 or 4 times before man said, "What on earth is this fool doing here? What's wrong with the world? I am yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." What Chesterton is really saying is, I am wrong with the world, you are wrong with the world, and that's what's wrong with the world. So when he looks inwards, he is not pointing his finger at Jesus. He's not pointing his fingers at those who are crucifying him. He's not pointing his fingers at all of those who tried them. He says, you and I receive the due reward of our deeds. He recognizes the problem of sin within his own heart. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you've ever had that horrible blessing of a car that doesn't work. You know, it's really a mixed blessing. There it is, all that big piece of metal. But the worst thing about a car that doesn't work is a car that doesn't work when the mechanic isn't there and does work when he is. Have you ever had one like that? Take it over and you've given all these symptoms and he starts it and it works perfectly. He says, I don't know what's wrong with it. Maybe it's the way you start it every morning, or maybe it's the way you drive, or whatever it is. And just after he's told you everything seems all right, you're onto the highway and there it goes again. The next time he is present, if it malfunctions, you're going to say, hallelujah. Because now it has malfunctioned in the presence of him who has the knowledge and the authority to diagnose what is wrong with that machinery. And here in the presence of Christ, this thief looks inwards and recognizes that the problem is within himself. Let me try and unfold for you how historians have tried to see this and yet not been able to point out sin. Some of them will describe it in many ways. It took a long time for Malcolm Muggeridge to recognize it, but Malcolm Muggeridge says this in his own eloquent, inimitable manner. He says this: it is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself. Tired of the struggle to be himself, he has created boredom out of his own affluence, impotence out of his own erotomania, vulnerability out of his own strength. He himself blows the trumpet that brings the walls of his own cities crashing down, until at last, having educated himself into imbecility, having drugged and polluted himself into stupefaction, he keels over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and becomes extinct. It is difficult to resist the conclusion that 20th century man has decided to abolish himself, having created boredom out of his own affluence. We have never had more television stations accessible to us. We've never had a more bored generation. Having created the impotence out of their own erotomania, we have become so erotic in our expressions that normal drives leave us impotent. They don't tempt us anymore. Having created vulnerability out of his own strength, which nation understands this better than our nation here today? as we have created vulnerability out of our own strength. We are so strong in awesome conventional power, and now having gotten for ourselves freedom and privileges which are delightful to have, some maniac somewhere renders us vulnerable when we want to enjoy that freedom. Follow what I'm saying? We've been made impotent out of our own eroticism. We've been made vulnerable out of our own strength. And he says we've created imbecility out of our own educational system, till I firmly believe what George Will of Newsweek magazine says. He's right when he says this. There is nothing so vulgar left in human experience for which we cannot fly in some professor from somewhere to justify it. I was in a home for unwed mothers yesterday. And you walk through the halls of a place like that, and you walk away with a very heavy heart. One 15-year-old who has come in with a baby for the second or the third time. I do not know what kind of a mental capacity a man has who would impregnate a little child who is 11 years old. I don't understand it, but we evidently have them. And yet if you see some of the magazines on sex education that learned people put out, you wonder whether they are even beginning to understand what our problem is. They actually believe that more education will keep us from hurting ourselves. D.L. Moody, who was not a very educated man, made a very educated point when he said this: if a man is stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track and you want to change him so you send him to college, at the end of his college education, he will steal the whole railway track. He is absolutely right, and I do not know of anybody who denies that.
Has your view of paradise become tarnished by the world? Is it possible that you've never even had a glimpse of the paradise that Ravi is teaching about this week? Be sure to tune in tomorrow for the continuation of this message titled, Paradise Regained. To order a copy of this message for yourself or anyone you know, call us at 1-800-448-6766. Or if you prefer to order online, visit our website at rzim.org. In Canada, that website is rzim.ca.
Your generous donations make this radio program and the other content we offer possible. As we strive to help the thinker believe and the believer think, would you consider partnering with us in prayer or financial support? To donate, you can go to rzim.org and click on the Donate tab. For those listening in Canada, that website is rzim.ca. When you contact us, be sure to let us know which radio station you're listening to.
From July 24th to July 27th, Refresh, Ready for College, is back for its second year in Atlanta, Georgia. We want to give you the space to think through some of the toughest challenges to Christianity. So if you're a student in high school or headed to college, don't miss this important week. Register now at rzim.org/refresh, and we'll see you at the Zacharias Institute on July 24th.
Just Thinking is a listener-supported radio ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.